Welcome to this new episode of the ORCA Files, a podcast where we try to unpack events in and around China and look at its geostrategic implications on China as well as on the world. Today's episode is in collaboration with Society for Policy Studies, an independent think tank located in New Delhi. I am your host Omkar Bhole, Research Associate at the Organization for Research on China and Asia. Today we have Commodore C Uday Bhaskar with us to discuss on the topic of rising strategic contestation between India and China in the Indian Ocean region. Commodore Bhaskar has served in the Indian Navy for 37 years and currently he is the director of the Society for Policy Studies. He has also headed Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis as well as National Maritime Foundation in the past. He is India's one of the most acclaimed experts on security and strategic affairs, especially on the maritime domain. He has edited books on nuclear, maritime, and global security issues. He also writes research articles for several reputed journals in India and foreign, along with the columns for some of India's leading publications like the Indian Express, the Economic Times, Dainik Jagran, and so on. Today he will discuss with us China's maritime power and its growing assertiveness in the Indian Ocean region, and also about India's actions to counter this challenge posed by our neighbor. Thank you, sir, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start with a very specific incident which highlights China's rising engagement in the Indian Ocean. In August this year, China docked its surveillance ship Yuanwang 5 in Hambantota port of Sri Lanka, which had created a serious security concerns in New Delhi. And despite India's opposition, Sri Lanka allowed the ship to dock at the Hambantota port almost for a week. In addition, since the last few days, there are also reports that Yuanwang 6 has also entered the Indian Ocean region. Given this trend, what should be India's preparedness to counter such involvement from China in our neighborhood?
India's response to the current pattern of China sending its surveillance ships into the Indian Ocean, particularly in areas that are very proximate to India, is something that would have to be monitored regularly. And the sense one gets is that the Indian security establishment and the Indian maritime agencies, that is the Navy and the Coast Guard, are already aware of this Chinese presence in the maritime domain in areas proximate to India. The extended response for India is, I think we have to, number one, make an assessment about China's naval presence and its surveillance capabilities as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, and those activities which we deem are detrimental to India's core national security interests. Now, in this particular case, in August, the surveillance ship that you have referred to, yes, there was a lot of controversy about whether or not it would be allowed to enter Hambantota, but we know that finally the Sri Lankan government accorded that particular permission. The broader context is, today we are in a situation where all major nations, particularly those with maritime naval capability and related surveillance capability, do carry out what is in the jargon called as quote unquote snooping activities. Now, there are a variety of such operations that are conducted on a regular basis. Number one, such ships, whether they are surveillance ships with the latest surveillance equipment, or traditionally in the old days, we used to have survey ships, which used to carry out hydrographic survey of the oceans of the world. And at that time, one of the primary requirements was to understand the pattern of temperatures and hydrography or sound in the oceans, particularly those areas where submarines would operate. So this was considered to be almost a routine activity. Today, technology allows much higher levels of granular surveillance on all dimensions. You can do surveillance from space, you can do surveillance from a surface ship, and you also have underwater surveillance. So I think India has to get on top of these technologies, acquire appropriate capability, and also accept that international law, maritime law that India always upholds, allows countries to send their ships, naval, surveillance, whatever be the nature of the ship, into what is called as the global common. There are rules and regulations about the entry of such ships into territorial waters and contiguous waters, and also some protocols about the exclusive economic zone. But by and large, I would say that China is, in a way, flexing its maritime and surveillance muscle, and India has to take note of this and acquire matching capability. And if need be, India should be able to also send its own surveillance ship to areas that China may be sensitive about if such a need arises. But I am not recommending a tit for tat. So I think we have to be very calibrated in our response. But the primary requirement is to enhance our capability in surveillance, both individually as India and perhaps also in partnership with like-minded countries, whether it is bilateral with the United States or as a group with the Quad. But these are larger political decisions that will have to be taken as we go along. Omkar?
Thank you, sir. Now, considering your point of keeping an eye on sensitive areas for the Chinese Navy, which I believe are largely Taiwan and the South China Sea, even China's President Xi Jinping has also emphasized on quote unquote winning local wars in his recent speech at the 20th National Party Congress. So, my question is, according to you, how important is Chinese Navy in achieving this goal, especially considering its emphasis on Taiwan and the South China Sea, which is also believed to be shifting gradually towards the Indian Ocean region?
My reading is that after the last party congress, where President Xi Jinping has been accorded his third term, which is unprecedented in Chinese political history, it is very evident that he is prioritizing the modernization of the Chinese military with considerable emphasis on what I would describe as trans-border military capability, of which the Navy and the Air Force are primary examples. But along with that, there are the strategic forces, and there are other capabilities in cyber and space that China is invested in at this point in time. My reading again is that the Navy will have a very important role to play as far as Taiwan and very obviously the South China Sea disputes are concerned. Yes, they will be complemented by other forms, other aspects, or other strands of Chinese military power, including the maritime militia, the land forces, the marines, the commando equivalents, and so on. But clearly, the PLA Navy would have a very important role to play, I think, in number one, intimidating. I repeat that, intimidating quote unquote Taiwan. There are various things that the PLA Navy can do short of actually getting into a war situation where there is an exchange of ordnance. For instance, a blockade is an option that Beijing could consider. The PLA Navy would have a very important role to play. And secondly, the PLA Navy also has now recognized that they need to acquire capability to, in a way, blunt or prevent any US naval response. Or let me put it this way, US military response. So again, the PLA Navy will come into a certain amount of relevance, which I think both Beijing, Taiwan, and the United States are all aware. And therefore, in summary, I would say that in terms of priorities for President Xi Jinping, Taiwan and South China Sea's dispute are on top of the list. My reading is the Indian Ocean is removed. Once removed in terms of the priorities, maybe it is lower down the ladder. That doesn't mean India should be complacent of that any of the other countries that have concerns about China. But for now, the PLA Navy, I think, will acquire necessary capability to play their role in terms of how the Taiwan issue and the South China Seas dispute are resolved. Omkar?
Thank you, sir, for such a comprehensive explanation. It really helped us put in perspective China's long game and the role of its maritime capability. My next question is regarding your recent article in the Indian Express. In this article, you have mentioned that India has become one of the few elite countries that possess submarine launched ballistic missiles, that is SLBMs. In addition, both India and China have launched their aircraft carriers this year. In light of these developments, how it will influence the comparative maritime power index between India and China? In other words, where does India stand vis-a-vis China in terms of its maritime strength?
If you look at the maritime trajectory, and I'm deliberately using the word maritime and not just naval, because maritime subsumes many other aspects of national maritime capability, including the Coast Guard, the ports and harbors, the merchant marine, and the kind of contribution that the maritime domain makes to comprehensive national power. So I'm using the word maritime in a holistic sense. And if you look at the trajectory of China and India, I would say that if you look at the end of the Cold War, 1991, India was slightly perhaps ahead of China at that time. China was just coming out of the Tiananmen incident and consolidating. And India, in turn, was also dealing with the end of the Cold War and the economic and financial crisis that India was facing. And we are aware that Prime Minister Narasimha Rao was able to stabilize and lead India to a certain path. But from then to now, if you look at the growth of maritime capability from 1992 to 2022, roughly 30 years, I would say China has made very impressive strides. And the asymmetry between India and China is quite stark. And India ranks far below China in terms of comprehensive maritime capabilities. And here, both the military and the non-military are very stark again. For instance, today China is pitting itself not so much with India. China has become very aware and reminds India quite often that India and China are not in the same league. And China is pitting itself against the United States of America, which is the world's number one power both economically and militarily. China is now number two, definitely in terms of its GDP and economic growth potential. But just as far as the Navy is concerned, this is a very interesting indicator that sometime between 2015 and 2020, China overtook the United States Navy, meaning the PLA Navy acquired greater number of platforms than the US Navy. And this is a remarkable feat because China is not considered to be a maritime power traditionally. In Asia, if you look at the major countries, it is Japan that has a certain pedigree as a maritime and a naval power. We remember what happened in World War II. And we know Japan's recovery post World War II in the merchant marine and the Coast Guard and maritime technology. But in the period 2015 to 2020, the PLA Navy overtook the US Navy. And today, it is estimated that the Chinese Navy has about 355 360 ships. We are talking about 21, 22. It is estimated that the PLA Navy will have 460 ships. Just look at these numbers. That they would add almost 100 ships in a matter of 7 to 8 years, naval ships. And the contrast of the United States Navy is that even with all the budgetary support that the US establishment is now indicating that they will provide to the US Navy, that the best case scenario is that in 2030, they may have 290 ships. So here are two takeaways, that in a matter of 7 to 8 years, the PLA Navy will move from 360 to 460 ships. The US will be at 290. And the PLA Navy will be 1.6 times the size of the US Navy. Just remember this figure, 1.6 times. So India does not figure in any kind of comparative matrix with China at this point in time, and all the macro indicators are very revealing. We know that China's GDP is greater than that of India by a factor of 2.5. And China's investment in the maritime domain is much higher than India. If India spends about 14-15% in the Navy, some estimates put China as 30% of its defense budget in the Navy. And look at the ports. India does not figure in the world's top 20 ports. China has 8 or 9 of them. So these are the stark indicators. So I think we have to acknowledge that today China's maritime profile is of a much higher magnitude than what India has been able to put together. And this includes the complete gamut of aircraft carriers, submarines, ballistic missiles, surveillance, whatever, kind of tangible platform or capability you want to consider. Omkar?
Thank you, sir. You rightly pointed out that China's maritime strength is rising rapidly in the last few years, and other countries have to catch up with that in order to counter China's growing challenge. I think this rapid increase in its maritime capacity is largely connected with one of its centennial goals. In recent times, China has been largely focusing on achieving the goal of building a world-class military by 2027, which marks the centennial anniversary of the PLA. The role of PLA Navy will be crucial in this. Do you think, as a result of this military modernization drive and a deadline announced by China for that, the PLA Navy will be more assertive than before, especially in the Indian Ocean region?
Well, number one, I think empirically we can arrive at a conclusion that the PLA Navy has definitely become more assertive over the last decade. Ever since the South China Sea dispute came onto the global stage, and you will recall that Philippines had gone for international arbitration at The Hague, and the decision went in favor of Philippines and against China. China rejected this particular tribunal award to Philippines,
Right.
and asserted its own claims based on a historical document, which the rest of the world, of course, does not accept. But we are in a situation where today China makes certain claims and it uses a fair amount of national muscle power, whether it is political, diplomatic, military, economic, any which way, to, in a way, consolidate its claim. And that is what we have seen in the South China Sea case after the award went against them in the international court. My reading is that ever since then, the Chinese Navy in particular and the maritime militia, the Coast Guard, all the maritime components of Chinese power have been used in a very assertive mode. You look at all the ASEAN countries who have been at the receiving end of this maritime assertiveness of China. We've also seen Japan. As far as the East Sea is concerned, they have their own experience with China. We in India have seen the PLA Navy entering the Indian Ocean after 2008-9, ever since they started the anti-piracy patrol. And now for 14 years unbroken, the Chinese Navy is in the Indian Ocean, in and around the Horn of Africa. They've also come to areas proximate to India like China, like Sri Lanka, Hambantota we've just seen. They have an agreement to provide submarines to Bangladesh. They have a close cooperation with Pakistan, with Myanmar. So, Chinese maritime presence, both in the Western Pacific, for instance, in the South China Sea, and in the Indian Ocean, are now going to increase. And the ultimate objective, as I see it, is China, first of all, wants to send a very strong signal to the United States about Taiwan, which President Xi Jinping has mentioned more than once, both in the party congress and in his most recent meeting with President Joe Biden of the United States at the Bali summit. But let me add that it is not as if President Xi Jinping is the first president to talk about Taiwan. Taiwan has figured in every Chinese leader's public statement, what they call as the unification, the reunification of the motherland. So it has been accorded a certain sanctity, almost theological sanctity, this reunification of the motherland. And just that President Xi Jinping has been more assertive and more visible than perhaps the others, but Taiwan is a very major security come identity issue, I would say. China feels incomplete. I've had occasion to talk to Chinese scholars, diplomats over the last 10, 20 years about Taiwan and suggested that, why have you made territoriality such a major issue? Why can't you live with the status quo where Taiwan is prospering? And Taiwan today is a leading supplier, producer, manufacturer of semiconductor chips, which are crucial for the whole world. So my question used to be, why are you upsetting the apple cart? Why don't you accept this territoriality and go towards the European Union kind of model, where borders should not matter so much? What we want is engagement. But don't give up your claim. You can keep your claim on the book. But they completely rejected, saying that you don't understand Chinese thinking on the subject. That for us, Chinese identity is incomplete without Taiwan. So in that sense, I don't want to digress. I think China is investing in its navy and sending a signal to the United States in the first instance, because I can't think of any other country that has the capability to make a difference to the Taiwan issue. And by extension, I think they are also aware of their vulnerability as far as the sea lines of communication are concerned, from the Persian Gulf, oil-rich hydrocarbons, Africa, to China through the Malacca Straits, which is why they talk about the Malacca dilemma. So the second level of Chinese strategy, as I see it, is to acquire a certain degree of autonomy that they would not be vulnerable to any third party, whether it's the US or anyone else, as far as their sea lines of communication are concerned, which is why the investment, for instance, in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa. So these are all, I would say, some of the pieces on the chessboard that we have to read or understand very carefully. Omkar?
Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful interview. It has really helped us understand different nuances of India-China strategic competition in the Indian Ocean region, and it goes beyond the usual narratives that are circulated in the mainstream media. I hope you have also enjoyed this interview, and I wish that we'll be able to conduct more such insightful interviews soon. Thank you once again, sir.
Thank you, Omkar.